It is quite well known that Ram Manohar Lohia is a socialist political thinker of Gandhian belief. It may be said that he was a Gandhian socialist who was influenced on the one hand by Gandhian Satyagraha, mass upsurge and non-violent techniques, and on the other by a socialistic pattern of society based upon all sorts of equality. He was not a Marxist in the true sense of the term. In fact, he has mentioned on several occasions that he believed both capitalism and communism were not suited to the freedom, development, and autonomy of individual. He was a socialist in the sense that he was interested in establishing a society where the difference between the rich and the poor could be minimal, where the poor could participate equally in the management and administration of the society, and where the rich could consider the poor to be their own brothers and sisters. Ram Manohar Lohia's political thought had several features which we will be discussing one after another. First is his emphasis upon revolution. He talked about a kind of sevenfold revolution based upon two principles which could be achieved through three instruments. The seven kinds of revolution that Lohia talked about were a procedural revolution, a revolution for equality, a revolution specifically for spiritual, political, and economic equality, a revolution of the people dominated by foreign powers against those foreign powers, a revolution of the poor against the rich, a revolution of the individual mind or the individual domain against the unnecessary encroachment of the state, and finally a revolution against armaments and weapons. So these were the sevenfold revolution that Lohia talked about. Now this sevenfold revolution or seven dimensions of revolution were to be directed simultaneously. These revolutions were to be organized simultaneously so that a really equal society, an egalitarian society could be established. Now this revolution was based upon the two principles. One is a sympathy for all the well-wishers and all the fellow feelings, a kind of sympathetic attitude, and the other is a kind of anger against injustice. So a sympathy for the so-called similar kinds of situations, or those who are the victims of injustice or those who want to deliver justice, and an anger against all kinds of injustices. So these were the two principles. And the three instruments that Lohia talked about were the jail, the spade, and the Satyagraha. Lohia said that if one has to wage a kind of protest, one should not be scared of going to jail. So, jail is a kind of instrument that could bring about this sevenfold revolution. The second is the spade. The spade is the weapon of the peasants. The peasants till their land with this instrument. So, we require the unity, the fellow feeling of the peasants in order to bring about a revolution. And finally, the Satyagraha. He believed that Satyagraha, or the non-violent technique of mass upsurge that Gandhiji talked about, is necessary for any kind of revolution. Once he said that normally it is said that the choice is between the ballots and the bullets. He said that it is true that ballot is necessary, But the choice is not between these two. The choice is really between Satyagraha and the bullet. Because if we resort to violence for creating a kind of society, the society that will ultimately come out will not be able to shark off violence from its all sides. So we have to depend upon non-violence, and then only can we devise a society, can we create a society, can we usher in a society which could thrive upon really non-violence that would open up the minds and horizons of all people. So this was Lohia's idea about sevenfold revolution based upon twin principles to be achieved through three instruments. Lohia also talked about several kinds of inequalities. It is quite natural that being a socialist, he talked about economic inequality, that is, the inequality between the poor and the rich. It is also perhaps a bit natural that being a nationalist leader, he talked about political equality. He said that a society could only develop a proper kind of management and administration if all the people could participate in it. So the first kind of political equality is the equality of people living in a nation, and the second kind of political equality is a kind of equality of nations, that is, the dominated nations, the colonized nations, the poor nations should acquire equality with the dominating ones, the colonies, and those who are not in a position to exert their preeminence. So there should go on a kind of struggle and protest in the colonies against the colonizers so that the colonies could become politically free, equal, and finally a kind of global order could usher in where all the nations would be on some sort of an equal footing. But at the same time, we should remember that Lohia talked about some other kinds of inequalities that were not dealt with by other leaders in such a detailed manner like Lohia did. One was the kind of inequality that existed in India on the basis of the color of the skin. We normally call it racial inequality. But this is particularly pertinent when we talk about the struggle of the blacks against the whites in the Western developed nations. Lohia was not thinking about that kind of racial inequality. He was talking about the kind of fragmentation or the kind of division that existed or even that exists even now within the population of India itself. In fact, the fair-skinned people used to get dominance and preeminence over the darker-skinned peoples. So this kind of inequality was to be targeted upon, and Lohia directed his attack against this inequality. Another kind of inequality that was no doubt talked about at that time, particularly by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and Lohia also echoed his voice, that is the kind of inequality that existed amongst different castes. So Lohia's framework of inequality embraced this caste inequality too. But it is really surprising that Lohia, living mostly in the early part of the 20th century and 2 decades after Indian independence or in the middle of the 20th century, talked about the kind of gender inequality that existed during that time, and he always said that if we cannot liberate the women of our country, the Indian nation cannot march forward. He, in fact, adopted several policies in his party and also engaged himself in several community project works for the upliftment of women. He talked about the establishing and creating latrines and toilets in every household, because he realized, or he had this experience from his mixing with the people of the villages, that the woman, in fact, due to the absence of latrines and toilets, used to have many kinds of practices that had their impact upon their health. And a nation needs healthy women for their development, for marching forward. And it is really surprising and astonishing that Lohia, so many decades back, talked about this particular infrastructural development, which he believed could make the Indian population really healthy and free from many common diseases, which could really be eradicated by establishing this infrastructure. He also talked about a particular aspect of the in the life of a woman, particularly of a village woman. In villages, we find that it is the woman who used to take or collect water from different water sources. Now, if the villages do not have proper sources of drinking water, at least nearby, then the woman had to walk a lot, and a lot of time, energy, etc. were wasted just for the collection of water. He talked about this particular aspect and emphasized and urged the Indian government to make proper arrangements for drinking water facilities. We all know that later a particular brand of feminism called eco-feminism emphasized upon this aspect. When Lohia was talking about all these things, no such band of ecofeminism was popular in India. In fact, the feminist movements or the feminist ideas were not at all popular at that time. They did not, in fact, take their shape in India. The Chipko movement even didn't happen at that time, but it is really significant that Lohia talked about these aspects and emphasized and urged the government to take on these matters, and so that the people of India, the real people of India who are living in villages and countryside, could really be free and could utilize their energy, time, and other aspects into really constructive work. In this respect, we should also mention that Lohia, like Narendra Dev, talked about eradication of illiteracy and the introduction of real education in a very proper and constructive manner, and this is to be done by the state. So he urged the government to introduce schools, at least primary schools, so that the children of the poor families, children from the remote areas, could become students and could know the basic education, so that the nation could in future bank upon their resource and could march forward depending upon this human resource, which could be utilized in a very proper manner. With this respect, Lohia, however, was very critical and said in his several writings, talked about the tremendous population that the Indian nation had. He believed that this population, instead of becoming a real resource, is hindering the development of the Indian nation. It is true that at that time the Indian population was mostly uneducated, without any job or without even any skill. So Lohia pointed out that various skill development programs should be introduced. Various basic educational practice should be introduced, so that this population, instead of becoming a burden, could become a real resource. But at the same time, Lohia also talked about how this population could be curbed and how different family planning measures could be introduced. Here, Lohia said that the economy of the Indian state no doubt depends upon its own resource, which consists of, apart from natural capital and other resources, human resources too. So, in order to develop the economy of the country, the human resource should be channelized in a proper manner so that this resource, along with natural and economic resource, could be able to lead India forward. Now, the next important aspect of Lohia's political thought relates to the economic domain, that is, the absolutely economic matters that come for establishing an egalitarian society. Lohia believed that India had very little capital, particularly at that time, but a huge population. So, a huge population is dependent upon a minuscule capital. This is a total imbalance, and it has to be eradicated, and has to be a proper balance is to be maintained and has to be created. So Lohia said that labor-intensive factories, labor-intensive industries should be established. He said about the utilization and application of machinery and tools in industries, but not in a very large scale manner, but in medium and small scale industries, these machineries and tools are to be utilized. In fact, on this particular point, although Lohia remained a very ardent admirer of Gandhi, he had a difference of opinion with Gandhi, because Lohia believed that cottage industries or spinning through charkha are not the ultimate solution for India's economic problems. What we need is small scale industries and medium scale industries, which should be labor intensive and at the same time which could utilize some techniques, some machineries and some tools. And this way, capital could be generated, capital could be formed, which is absolutely essential for the economic development of any country. So capital formation, emphasis on capital formation is one of the important aspects of Lohia, and he believed that with increasing capital formation and with a decreasing trend in the population, a balance could be established that could lead India on the path of economic development. Now, Lohia's economic development, or the urge to establish the egalitarian society, is also based upon the autonomy of the individuals, the moral aspect of the individual, and the political equality of the individual. Although Lohia, like Narendra Dev, was not an advocate of moral socialism, he also said about some kind of ethics and some kind of morality that should be developed within the human beings. In this particular respect, he said that the individual's lives, the domain of the individual life should be made autonomous, should be made free from the unnecessary encroachment of the state. This argument is particularly significant because there is a criticism or an allegation against the socialist states that the socialist states are all too powerful, interfering and making their presence felt even in the very, very private aspect of an individual. So, against this, Lohia made a fervent appeal that the state should restrict itself to the development of the individual, not in the privacy of the individual. It should not come in the private domain of the individual. If the state can make the other aspects, that is infrastructural development, capital development, educational development, then and then the society itself could take care of itself and the human beings could develop and march forward. Here he in fact had talks with Nehru and the other Congress leaders regarding the 5-year plans that were taken under the Nehruvian regime. And in fact, it may be mentioned here that Nehru also declared himself to be a socialist much before independence, and it always happens to be some kind of an enigma to the socialist leaders that if Nehru is a socialist, then why is he not joining the Socialist Party and why is he remaining within the Congress? So this kind of a relationship and this kind of a tension always exists between Nehru and the socialist leaders, and it particularly exists between Nehru and Ram Manohar Lohia. So when the Nehru government undertook the planning policy and started the 5-year plan programs, Lohia had talks with Nehru and urged him that the 5-year plans should restrict itself to the development of the basic infrastructure of the society, the basic industrial base of the society, the basic agricultural framework of the society, and to the basic educational needs of the society. But the planning should not make the state too powerful so that the state could dictate all these things and the individual becomes just a tool in the hands of the state. And Lohia, as he was not orthodox Marxist or an orthodox communist, he always had a feeling of a skeptic feeling vis-a-vis the state, and had perhaps a kind of apprehension that if the state was made too powerful, then the individuality or the individual aspect of the state would be sacrificed at the altar of the state. Lohia, in fact, in this particular point, had some kinds of agreement with Acharya Narendra Dev. When Narendra Dev considered society to be an equally aspect of the individuals, Lohia had some kinds of disagreements. That is, when Narendra Dev said that society and individuals are equally important, Lohia had some kinds of differences. But when Narendra Dev said that the individuals' egos, individuals' negative aspects are to be sacrificed for the development of the society, and the individual's positive aspects are to be enshrined within the society, Lohia agreed with Narendra Dev and argued that it is true that individuals' negative aspects do not lead to the ushering in of a true society. On the contrary, the positive aspects, the constructivist aspect, the enthusiastic aspect of the individual lead to the ushering in of a truly egalitarian, constructive society at large. Finally, we come to an important aspect of Ram Manohar Lohia when he talked about the foreign policy of the state. At that time, particularly after Indian independence, two blocks emerged at the world level, and most of the nations were becoming supporters of either of these two blocks. One was the capitalist liberal democratic bloc led by the United States, and the other was the socialist bloc led by the USSR. Ram Manohar Lohia on this particular point had some agreements with Nehru when he said that the path of Indian foreign policy should be one of non-alignment. That is, it should not follow the path of the socialist bloc, and it should not follow the path of the liberal democratic capitalist bloc. So he talked about this irrelevance of these two blocks, and likewise he talked about the irrelevance of both capitalism and communism. So in Lohia, we come across a kind of indigenous, which may be called Gandhian socialism, which was based upon his practical experiences as well as his scholarship and his reading of different socialist practices throughout the world. And this particular aspect of socialist political thought has truly enriched the Indian political thought, and today we can in fact definitely get enriched and get many clues and cues from Lohia's political thinking.